Professor Erwin Cutler is the chair of the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, a professor of law at McGill University, former Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, and longtime member of Parliament, and an international human rights lawyer. A constitutional and comparative law scholar, Professor Cutler is the author of numerous publications and seminal legal articles, and has written upon and intervened in landmark Charter of Rights cases in the areas of free speech, freedom of religion, minority rights, peace of law, and war crimes justice. I could read Professor Cutler's introduction for the rest of this event, but for the sake of getting to the topic at hand, I'll pass the floor to Professor Erwin Cutler. You're on mute, Professor Cutler.
Thank you, Adam. I'm delighted to be able to participate in this important event, jointly sponsored by both the Harvard Jewish Law Students Association and Muslim Law Students Association, and to appear together with Adrian Zenz. Adrian was our first witness before the Interparliamentary Alliance on China, where I'm the Canadian co-chair, and it was as a result of his compelling testimony then, which as we witnessed today, that resulted in our IPAC group, as I call it, taking up the Uyghurs' case and cause as our first priority. And with regard to Rayhan, she is a senior fellow at our Raoul Wallenberg Center, and I was delighted to join both of them in their compelling testimony before the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee, International Human Rights of the Canadian Parliament, which, as a result of their testimony and others, made a unanimous all-party determination that what was happening to the Uyghurs were acts constitutive of genocide. In speaking about the unspeakable mass atrocities, as Adrian Zenz spoke about them, that are targeting the Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims in the Xinjiang region, I'm reminded of the words of Nobel Peace Laureate Elie Wiesel, to the effect that silence in the face of evil is complicity with evil itself. And as he would remind us again and again, that indifference always means coming down on the side of the victimizer, not on the side of the victim. And as you put it, Adam, if you save a single life, it is as if you have saved an entire universe. And as Hassan put it, that what we are witnessing is a frontal assault on Muslim identity. By the way, about saving a single life appears in the Quran as well as in our Talmudic sources. These words, I have to say, underpin my own recent testimony at the urgent two-day Canadian parliamentary hearing, which I referenced, and where just before I began to speak, this was in July, I was haunted then by the chilling footage that I had viewed prior to my testimony of Uyghurs, heads shaven, blindfolded, shackled, and herded onto trains headed for concentration camps. I don't make and don't like to make any analogies to the Holocaust, but the graphic videos against the backdrop of what was happening were painfully evocative. The Holocaust and the genocide that have followed from Rwanda to Srebrenica to Darfur to Myanmar were unspeakable, not only because of the horrors themselves, but because these horrors were preventable. Nobody could say we did not know. We knew, but we did not act. Just as now with regard to the Uyghurs, no longer can we say we do not know, we know, and we must act. Beijing's mass atrocities, and Adrian has referred to them, but the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee, which determined that there were acts constitutive of genocide, referenced, among other things, the mass internment in the concentration camps with survivors testifying to forced enslavement, torture, rape, disappearance, and murder. Second, the massive, inhumane, and increasing coercive population controls, again, as Adrian described. Third, the forcible separation of more than 500,000 Uyghur children from their families. Fourth, state-orchestrated incitement to genocide, as the Supreme Court of Canada put it in the trilogy of cases, that the Holocaust did not begin with words. It began, as the court put it, with the incitement to hate and to genocide. And we have the constant referencing to the Uyghurs as, quote, malignant tumors, which have to be eradicated, and so on. Five, a massive surveillance state underpinning the world's most technologically sophisticated genocide, as Rayhan put it in an article which he co-authored with Yona Diamond, published in Foreign Policy magazine. And finally, massive state-sanctioned assaults on Uyghur memory, religion, culture, language, and identity. And so the question, what then can we do? Because it's important that we not only unmask and expose these crimes against humanity, but act upon them to secure justice for the victims and accountability for the violators. Let me just, for reasons of time, just enumerate a number of one-liners as to what we can do and what Harvard law students in particular can do. Number one, the Harvard law students should join the call made by IPAC and others for the Secretary General, UN Secretary General, to appoint an international independent investigative mechanism by the UN, similar to what was done, read the Rohingya, to make the appropriate determinations regarding these mass atrocity crimes. I would add also to appoint a special envoy with regard to the Xinjiang region. Second, to recommend that the US Congress, like the Canadian parliamentary inquiry, to make a determination of these crimes against humanity effectively constitute acts of genocide. Third, to call upon the United States and the international community to invoke and implement the responsibility to protect doctrine, committing the international community to protect the targeted Uyghurs. Four, that governments, as the US government has done, should impose Magnitsky justice sanctions targeted at the individual human rights violators responsible for the mass atrocities against the Uyghurs. Number five, call upon corporations with supply chains linked to forced Uyghur labor and to sanction these corporations and to strengthen import mechanisms to prevent products made with forced labor from entering our markets. And here, Adrian Zenz has compellingly identified this as well. Six, call upon governments to conduct reviews to monitor technology companies involved in supporting the pervasive state surveillance of the Uyghurs. Seven, to expedite refugee applications of Uyghurs fleeing persecutions. And finally, the governments should take up the case, for example, of disappeared Uyghur Edbar Assad, to put a face on the plain pain and plight of the Uyghurs. I suspect Rayhan will be speaking about this. To close, let there be no mistake about it. Silence and indifference in the face of evil will be complicit with evil itself. We must act, and Harvard law students can make an important contribution to the action to be taken. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Cutler. We'll now go to our last speaker, and after that, we will have some time for questions and discussion. I'll say to the students from now, in preparation, we have close to 100 people in attendance today, which we're very happy to see. So you're welcome to submit questions by the chat function, the Q&A chat function, or you can also raise your hands, and we can selectively unmute you during our Q&A session. But first, we'd like to hear from Rayhan. Rayhan Asat is an attorney and the president of the American Turkic International Lawyers Association. She's also a chair of the Women Entrepreneurs Initiative with Harvard alumni entrepreneurs in DC. Rayhan's practice focuses on anti-corruption, human rights, and business. She's been recognized as a senior fellow with the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, and she's a frequent speaker in national and international law conferences. She's been featured in the New York Times, the BBC, CNN, Voice of America, The Hill, The Globe, and The Mail, and many other media outlets. And her writings have also appeared in many of those media outlets. And she has appeared occasionally at Harvard to speak about how the Harvard community can also contribute to this issue. So please, Rayhan, we'd love to hear from you.
Thank you so much for having me. And I wish we could engage in this discussion face to face, but unfortunately, here we are. Because I recall last time I spoke to Harvard students, that was March 9, right before COVID. And I returned to my alma mater at the invitation of my dear professor, Professor Alford, and the HLS advocates to give talk and share my own journey of navigating the impact of the Chinese concentration camps as an Uyghur. It was my defining Veritas moment, the first time I'm sharing a deeply personal and painful story in a public setting, and it was at Harvard. The HLS community was so welcoming, and I was surrounded by my mentors, faculty members, and law students who were rooting for me, and including many Chinese students who came to learn. Seeing so many familiar faces, I felt I returned to home to share my wounds and scars. And everyone was so embracing and trying to take off that little pain. And thank you so much for all being there, especially for Jasmine and Samantha, who made a video with me about my brother. In that video, after I said, my brother, they uttered, our alum's brother. I'll never forget those who stood by me, because that video also became a public declaration of me demanding the Chinese government to unconditionally release my brother. Since then, in May, my fight to free my brother has been featured in the New York Times, and ever since I became the voice for the voiceless. And to give you all a bit of a background, this is my brother. He is a cutting-edge Uyghur entrepreneur and philanthropist who established one of the largest social media platform, Facebook, if you will, but also combined the features of the New York Times that had column, news, history, and the law sections. And here he is. This was days before he was disappeared. He was carrying a trophy because they recognized him as an outstanding community organizer for a boxing tournament between China and the Central Asian countries. Here he is. In 6 months prior to his enforced disappearance, he organized an event called I Love Xinjiang, 60 years celebration of Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. He called everybody from all walks of life, including the Han Chinese community, to stand together, to be the bridge between different cultures. And this picture of him, here he's in America. So in 2016, he was nominated to participate in an international program that organized and sponsored by the US Department of State. He came here as part of the delegation representing China along with 800 Chinese individuals. During his trip, he brought nothing but love. As you see, a Uyghur hat was given to one of his hosts. And these are examples of him being featured in the Chinese state-owned media and high-level government meetings. Here it's a Chinese New Year's gala as an honored guest. And all of those honors was taken away after he came to the United States. Within weeks after returning from the US back to China, he disappeared into the shadow of these internment camps. Many world leaders, including Han Chinese citizens, were nominated and participated in this program. And his fellow Chinese delegates, they're excelling in their career, except my brother is serving a 15-year sentence in the Chinese concentration camps. And many of you know Tencent, and here again, he's participating in the government-sponsored programs. Just like my brother, I also contributed to the betterment of the world. And before I believed China can be a force for good, I organized the very first Turkey-China conference when I was working as an attorney. And here, my brother, his platform is called Bagdash, and that's why his nickname is also called Bagdash. Here he is celebrating the event, promoting it on his platform and saying how proud he was of me organizing an event at a scale so large that I brought academics, legal practitioners, judges from China, 17 of them to Turkey to engage in dialogue and discussion and meet my fellow Turkish colleagues. But none of that spared him from being sent to these concentration camps. And I think this is a clear example of nobody is spared. Anybody can be a target for the concentration camps. And it's so ironic that here I am fighting for him to free him from these camps, and without a trial or anything, they gave him a 15-year sentence in the hope to normalize the concentration camps to prisons like elsewhere. Make no mistake, these are concentration camps created to physically and mentally break people. 4 years and 6 months, we have not heard a word from him. We don't know if he is alive. And as my panelists laid out, we are witnessing one of the prolonged enforced disappearance arbitrary detention of a large group of people based solely on their ethnicity or race or religion, and it is a genocide. Now, I spoke the truth, even if my voice shook on March 9. What's life has been since then? It's been incredibly difficult. People often cite speaking truth to power as challenging, but for me, it's been speaking truth to authoritarianism and mustering up all my strength to scream out loud injustice. I have been viciously attacked by the 50 cents army of the Chinese government that I am lying. But I also want to say that some of the kindest comments are also from Chinese people. Our governments and actions don't impute to us. They have these trollers labeled my brother with all sorts of extremist labels and even wish that he dies in these camps. But most violating thing happened on last Friday at Brandeis University. I was part of a panel of 4 scholars, and I was the only non-white person. The Chinese Students and Scholars Association at Brandeis University protested to cancel the event. And during one of our speakers, they put the Chinese national anthem to disturb the event for 15 seconds. But when it came to me, they hijacked my screen. And just like today, I started to talk about my brother, and they started erasing him. They started to paint all over him. And that moment, I just felt like so violated, my own personal safety, my brother's safety. Like I was terrified. And sadly, I mean, you know, it's deeply rooted in racism that the very fact that they're singling out me to conduct this kind of personal attacks. And I asked Brandeis University to investigate this, because this kind of cultural impunity for silencing voices or activists or advocates cannot be permitted on American campuses. So coming here today again to share this story, I was a little bit deterred just for a second. But if that experience taught me anything, if in that moment I was frightened, I cannot imagine what my brother is going through in these camps. So I must continue to speak up. So over the past few months, the HLS advocates under the leadership of the HLS Advocates Group and activism director Sandra Anton, they have been issuing the statements that are working floating around in different departments and schools. And I do feel like she has been advocating more my brother just as loud as me, and if not louder. Along with her, then there are other students from Harvard, Sophia and two Rebeccas. These are beautiful Jewish students who are reaching out to different student organizations for them to stand with me and the Uyghur people in solidarity. Through these kindness and support, I found a silver lining. I found that there are a beautiful army of generous and compassionate alumni and friends who are standing with me. So Harvard prides itself forging global leaders. Many of you will indeed become shapers and movers of our society. I take a tremendous pride for being an independent and strong woman and attorney. It's so hard for me to ask for help, but I need your support. The Uyghur people need your support. Many people are looking away in the face of genocide. Fellow Harvard alumni, please don't become bystanders to genocide. So I want to end with a comment I made on one of my pieces with the Harvard Crimson. I ask you to join the fight, be the light, be the integrity, be the voice for my brother and my people, because you're my people too. And if you do so inclined, we are forming a Harvard coalition of Uyghur Human Rights Working Group with one of the brightest alumni of Harvard University. So please join. If we get together, brainstorm together, we can end this. Thank you.
Rehan, thank you so much for sharing your truly devastating personal story. And we all grieve for the circumstances and pray for your brother's release and are ready to work to do our part. To all of the attendees, as Rehan mentioned, you may have seen Google form in the chat to join the Harvard Coalition for Uyghur Freedom. And if you're interested in joining, please fill out that form. We'll now move on to Q&A. So if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand on Zoom or enter a question through the Q&A function. First question here is, and you sort of touched on this, Rehan, but we can open it up to all of the panelists. How do you keep up your hope through all of this?
To be honest, I thought despite all this criticism, at least the Chinese governments would be deterred. But the recent report came out that they're more determined and more resolved to build new camps. As we speak, the Chinese government continues to build these camps. And I was really outraged and disappointed in the silence of world leaders, especially from the Muslim world. And I don't think religion alone should be a factor where people share their compassion and empathy. It should transcend boundaries, religion, race, or anything. But events like this, people like Sandra and all these wonderful people who are reaching out to me to offer like how can they help to end this, and also just like seeing like how my parents through all of this still remaining so compassionate and graceful, I think make me still hopeful in all of this.
Professor Kotler, I think I see that you're speaking, but you're on mute there.
First political prisoner I took up was the case of the Soviet dissident Anatoly Sharansky. And after some 8 years in prison, I was with his wife. We were in the States. We were meeting with students, and one of the students put up his hand and asked a question. And he said, Mrs. Sharansky, you're asking us to demonstrate, what are all these demonstrations doing? It's 8 years and your husband is still in prison. And she responded, yes, he's still in prison, but he is alive. And I believe if we continue to demonstrate, we may yet witness his release. If we don't demonstrate, he will simply disappear. A year later, Sharansky was released. And so we have to continue the action and intensify the action, as Rehan has commended. And I'm delighted about the Harvard Coalition that I think will be a mainstay of the work that we need to do.
I would just briefly comment that we are moving into a phase of post-evidence. We now have so much evidence on so many things, and I'm not saying that gathering evidence is over, it continues, but we are moving into a phase of response, of waiting on the world, of exerting pressure, of things filtering down. And it's a test for the world. The atrocity is a test for world leaders, for world faiths. It's a test of who really cares about what really are our values. And that is the situation we are increasingly moving into. And I think it's important to stay determined at this point.
Another question here, sort of touching on that topic, Dr. Zenz, and it can be open to all the panelists, is Professor Cutler said, we know, but we did not act like in Rwanda and in other parts of the world. So this participant would like to know why the world, and especially Islamic countries, are so silent about the situation of the Muslim Uyghurs.
I think one of the ways, and it's so obvious because the Chinese government, again, we're talking about the world's superpower. A lot of these countries are beholden to the Chinese government because of these Belt and Road Project and debt entrapment policies. All of these countries are not economically powerful countries, but those ones who are speaking out, Western democracies, first of all, they are obviously 2/3 of world economy. So we're talking about countries that don't have good economy, that are very much dependent on China. That's the one element. The second element, obviously, they also have their own track record of human rights violations and abuses. So I think combined with that, but I also do say that I think the views of those governments don't impute and represent the collective views of the population, of the people. I'm pretty sure a lot of Muslims, they do feel strongly about it, but except they don't see any form of leadership from their own government to take further action.
I think this is a reflection of Chinese elite capture, of Chinese influence operations that we see also with the World Health Organization, with other organizations. And this is something that must be systematically identified and countered, actually. At this point, if Western countries write a letter to the United Nations, China is going to try to mobilize twice as many countries to justify what it is doing with the Uyghurs as the Western countries who condemn it. And I think this needs to be recognized and looked at and dealt with. But at the same time, I think we see many governments also, unfortunately, in the Muslim world who are more interested in their power. But I would really like to also look not just at governments, but also civil society in our countries and in Muslim countries, intellectuals, religious leaders, faith leaders. There was a letter signed by many faith leaders in the United Kingdom, for example, Jewish leaders, Christian leaders, Muslim leaders, others. Civil society also in Islamic countries, especially the ones that are part of the Belt and Road Initiative. I think there's been some disappointments in that respect with the largest Muslim organization in the world, who is based in Indonesia. Basically, coming up with excuses and everything. I really hope that there can be developments in Muslim civil society, especially.
Adam, for a moment, just to add to the important comments made by both Rayan and Adrian, I think what the Beijing has been seeking to do is to bully the countries one by one, targeting Australia, targeting Canada, etc. That's the importance, therefore, of establishing an interparliamentary alliance with China. So we have a concerted action, and right now we have more than 20 parliaments and more than 800 parliamentarians that are speaking out. What we need, and I hope we will get with President-elect Biden, is an intergovernmental alliance, a community of democracies and others which will stand together and hold Beijing to account. Because the economic power of each of the countries standing alone with regard to China, be it Australia or Canada, is asymmetrically in favor of China. But if the United States joins with the European Union, which is on the verge, as we are meeting, of adopting Magnitsky sanctions, that will represent a dramatic shift, a tipping point, and the advocacy can begin to be effective, along with, as Adrian said, the importance of faith leaders, public intellectuals in the Muslim world and outside of it coming together, because civil society, compelling voice, can tip the balance here as well.
Thank you so much. We have maybe just a few minutes left, since we like to give students a few minutes to get to 1 o'clock Eastern Time classes. But I'd like to maybe ask one more question, and then we can close it out if any of you would like to share closing remarks. My question is especially, Dr. Zenz touched on the forced labor aspect and the supply chains that maybe we as consumers, it doesn't matter whether we're a law student or where we are, but as consumers, we all have some amount of power in that regard to at least choose what we're consuming. Is there a source or any good research that's been done on which companies are implicated in supply chains that trace back to Xinjiang? And how do you recommend, on a practical level, an individual try to, implement some kind of personal boycott campaign or get a boycott campaign together?
There is a large campaign that is joined by initially 180, and I believe it's now over 300 organizations. and that is called the Coalition to End Forced Labor in Xinjiang, or among the Uyghurs. And they have a website, and they have information, and they link to research, and they create awareness, and they have a social media outlets. There is related organizations, including my own institution, Victims of Communism. If you follow them on Twitter or follow me on Twitter and on social media, and there's others, other entities and advocacy organizations around the world. If you Google Uyghur forced labor or Coalition to End Uyghur forced labor, you'll find a lot of specific information, including company names, including information about products, about textiles, about garments, etc. As we speak, the United States Senate is going to be, there's efforts to introduce the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act here in the United States. It was passed by the House. It should hopefully be introduced to the Senate before the end of this year, if not the next year. Follow that, write to senators, write to politicians. Harvard has a voice. So it's called the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. And these are things that are happening. Important policy processes are happening. The Trump administration was contemplating some embargoes on Xinjiang cotton. It was pulled back at the last minute. Again, there's ways to write to government. But I think in terms of advocacy, there's also the World Uyghur Congress. The Uyghur Human Rights Project sits in Washington, D.C. There's a group called Campaign for Uyghurs, who also did advocacy. They did a sit-in protest during Fashion Week in New York City and in Manhattan on Fashion Street, and had information out there. So these are things that you can look out for.
And I just want to build upon that, add 2 points. I think there's so many ways, creative ways we can campaign to end forced labor, Uyghur forced labor changing global supply chain, because this is a big issue, because this goes to show that the forced labor reached North American shore and we are becoming complicit. On the bill that Adrian mentioned, I do hope you do write to Senator Mitch McConnell, Senator Risch, to make sure that they do put this on the floor for a vote so we can actually get it passed as soon as possible. Second is that the Jewish Movement for Uyghur Freedom is an organization that I serve as an advisor. We do have a phone bank where we call senators every Tuesday. So every 2 weeks, Tuesday, please do join these efforts. But most importantly, join and use your voice. Use your voice on social media. Write personal letters to these companies that are implicated and ask them, I'm a consumer. Can I trust your product is ethically sourced? Thank you.
Yeah, Adam, just to say that the Canadian Parliament is introducing similar initiatives to that in the US House and Senate.
Thank you all so much. I think that's about all the time we have. Many people messaged us as the panelists to ask, some are from different universities or from different schools within Harvard, to ask how they can join and get involved. Perhaps I'll drop a contact email, or maybe Adam, just go ahead and drop the contact email for Jalsa since I'm closing the event out, and anyone who'd like to sort of get in the loop and so on, just shoot an email to the email that Adam puts in now, and we can hopefully all stay in touch. I think lastly, also, we had, as Harvard student organizations, we had, wanted to make this a lunch event, and if this had been in person, we would have probably gotten our lunch from a wonderful restaurant in Cambridge called Silk Road, which also has an amazing story. If you look them up online in the Boston local news, they have some stories to tell about how their own family has been affected by this. But in the spirit of a lunch event, which these HLS events usually are, I encourage you all, if you're in Cambridge or elsewhere, to look up and find your local Uyghur restaurant or Uyghur cuisine. I know one restaurant that actually had to shut down because they got, you can call it internet bombed by bots and various pro-Chinese government supporters who just gave them a bunch of bad ratings on Yelp and Google reviews and so on. And they were a really wonderful restaurant in Washington, D.C. and had to shut down because of that. And so it's a really simple way to show support to the Uyghur diaspora, many of whom have come here as refugees to flee the issue. But I'd really just like to finish by thanking all of our speakers for taking their time today to speak to us, and to thank JALSA for putting this event together, along with Malsa and all the people from both organizations that helped. And please do stay in touch. We're trying to make this a springboard for further action, and not just, a one and done event. So thank you, and we hope you all have a good day, and we hope that you've come away with this with action items and ways to contribute to this cause. And please, if any of the speakers would like to share parting words, go ahead.
Well, I just want to thank you, Hassan, and thank you, Adam, for this joint sponsorship. I think that alone was a very important symbolic partnership. And just to say, at this point, our responsibility, in a word, is to secure justice for the victims and accountability for the human rights violators. That's what the pursuit of justice is all about. And that's where Harvard law students can play such a central role.
I'd very much like to agree with those words, and also extend a warm thank you for inviting me and giving this platform. And it's very encouraging to see interest, especially among the young generation and university students. And do not underestimate what you're able to do.
And I just want to add that, as you can see from my Crimson article, the title is Back at Harvard, Seeking Truth and Justice for My Brother. And I hope you all can join me. Thank you.
The recording has stopped.
Thank you all so much. I've got a 1 o'clock class as well, so I'm going to head out. But it was really wonderful to meet you, for Professor Cutler, and to see you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Pleasure to participate.
Professor Cutler and AJ.
And I hope we can continue.
Rehan, you were about to say something?
Oh, I need to talk to you at some point soon, hopefully.
Okay, I'll give you a call this afternoon.
Yes, please do.
Okay,
Right.
thanks.
Okay.
I want to
Bye.
follow up on the Brandeis incident. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.